You can just read it for mechanics and get some of the lore and stuff, but if you pay attention to what's going on in the margins, there is a whole other story.
There is an entire secret language in this book that I cannot wait for people to decode.
Today's Meet Your Maker is sponsored by Noble Knight Games. They are the site to find the world's largest selection of games, including new releases, out-of-print, rare, and collectible items. Use promo code TTN10OFF for 10% off your next purchase at nobleknight.com. Hey everyone, I'm Xander Jeanneret, and this is Tabletop News. I'm here with Rowan Hall and Spenser Starke, the creators of Candela Obscura. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Of course, thank you.
Always.
Yeah. So first of all, you are familiar with games in general. What was the game that made you fall in love with gaming? Like either a board game, TTRPG game?
Yeah, I mean, the first board game I ever played was X-Wing. Fantasy Flight game.
That's intense.
Star Wars game. And it was intense, but I had friends who were like, come over, we're gonna show you this really cool game.
Yeah.
And I started playing that and I was like, this is a blast. We spent like 8 hours playing the first time and I was like, all right, I see kind of what board games have become, because before that it was like Monopoly and all the stuff that like people know casually.
Yeah.
But X-Wing really was like the first thing that I dove into.
Did you pull out the rulers and protractor?
Oh yeah. I mean, it was a blast.
Nice.
But that really, I think, shaped for me the like way in which games could simulate certain genres, because dogfighting was such a unique genre, and that's what it was all about.
That's true. Yeah. How about you, Ron?
I played D&D, everyone gets introduced to D&D, but the game that made me reconsider games was probably Blades in the Dark.
Yeah.
Ooh, Blades in the Dark, nice.
And this wasn't my first time playing it, but it was a really pivotal moment for me playing it, and it was when you invited me to your home game, and it happened to be Masquerade Night.
Yeah,
and
Abria was in our home game, and Gina DeVivo.
What an amazing
Friends
group.
of the family.
Friends of the family, yeah.
And so everyone was like, go all out. We fully dressed up. So it had LARP-esque like vibes.
It was also Beyblades in the Dark.
Wait, what?
Yes. So we hacked Blades in the Dark, so the engagement rolls and big, exciting, like momentous rolls used Beyblades instead.
Like the spinning tops.
Yeah, so we would spin the top. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it was amazing.
Yeah.
And also, that was the first table that I was at where everyone really sat down and we're like, or can we really go there emotionally?
Yeah.
And you guys had experience with that, but I was new to the table, and it was so kind the way you all introduced me, and we put my character through the ringer.
Yeah, well.
Emotionally.
Well, we had props and all sorts of stuff too.
Yeah.
It was a blast. So.
So you mentioned either discovering what they could be or this sort of LARP aspect. What got you into designing the games?
Yeah, so Candela, well, for me, I came from, I was designing Icarus, which I know we've played together before.
Yes, yeah.
And that was really an experiential kind of game, like the stacking of the dice.
Yeah.
And Icarus sort of represents the like nervousness we feel about the state of the world that we're playing in, right? And falling apart. And
There seems to be a through line of nervousness, like Alice is missing. Or...
How you doing, champ?
I'm okay. No, but like I want that. I want a visceral feeling at the table. Like that's the thing that drives me in games. And so, so then Kids on Brooms is another one that was like a genre emulation game that was like looking at the genre that I love so much that I felt conflicted about participating in. And so to have
something
the opportunity to be able to like still play in a world that I grew up in and loved, in a space that felt safe for everybody that I wanted to play with was really cool. And then obviously Alice is Missing was another one that was just like, it was about an experiential, it was about an experience for the audience. And so when we came into Candela, I think that was like one of the things we set forward was like find the humanity in horror and the horror in humanity.
We say that all the time in the room.
There's like the core tenet of the game, and I think that really speaks to like, yes, it's a horror game, but it's really a horror game about humanity. As much as monsters are scary, humans are just as scary. And so that's kind of how we approach it. And then you came in.
Spenser brought me in, and I was brought in specifically for lore. And then, my job expanded because we just vibed. But my love and way into TTRPGs is lore. And the big thing about world building in TTRPGs is I think you need to give people, when you write a book, just enough that the world feels fleshed out in full, but you also have to build a sandbox where they can build their own castles. And so in Candela, there are a lot of little hooks in places where it's like, if you like this, you dive further. So that, one, so it's not as difficult to pick up.
Sure.
Ideally, Candela Obscura, if one person at the table knows how to play it and knows where it is in the Fairelands, you're fine. But also, just because the more a table builds their own lore, the more invested they are.
Absolutely, yeah. Can you go into a little bit? We've mentioned it previously, but what is Candela Obscura for maybe people who are not familiar?
We were just joking. Eldritch horror, Eldritch trauma.
Yeah.
But it's an investigator game that is set in kind of that approximate place between Gaslamp and the burgeoning of electricity.
The Great Gatsby.
The Great Gatsby meets like Paris during the Belle Epoque. And there is a secret society of investigators who are charged with protecting the world from the magic that comes from beyond the flare or beyond the veil. And it's magic with a K. So it's like esoteric, spooky magic. It's not fairy sparkles magic.
Dang it. No.
You could do it.
You can do whatever.
And then meanwhile, there are a lot of other powers attempting to harness magic for the forces of evil or what they believe to be the forces of good. There are governments that believe perhaps maybe they can do magic. I think a lot of this world building was placing in rumors and ideas that people had.
Well, and Rowan comes from a place of being mythologist, which means that her whole thing is like you have an amazing podcast called Lilling and Fable. I'm going to plug it. Lilling and Fable. It's an amazing podcast that is like over 100 episodes of just mythology and history and mystery. And so when I brought her in, it was a lot about I need somebody who specifically is good at not only developing original lore, but also drawing on the myths of the world that we know. Because one of the things about Candela that I think we tried really hard to thread the needle on.
Needle and thread joke, huh?
Needle and thread joke. Chapter 2, needle and thread.
If you can get Vassal and Veil in here, I'd be very impressed.
Good. Yeah,
I said Veil.
Oh, there it is.
You did. Love it. We're 3/4 of the way there. But one of the things that we tried really hard to do was to make the world feel familiar.
Sure.
Familiar enough that as players you could come in and just kind of already know where you're playing. Even though it's a fictional world, it feels familiar enough that you're I kind of know, I know Turn of the Century, so I kind of know this, but also make it accessible enough that that we allow for fictional spaces to explore other things. So inspired by myths, inspired by lore, inspired by cryptids. Right? But then also leaving the space to be no, these are original. They aren't necessarily cryptids from one place or one time. They are vast and open.
And I think part of making it so familiar was putting in these sort of pillars of villainy. And also pillars of style. So we have Prohibition. Everybody loves Prohibition. It was a theme that kept coming back. So we built Scarlet, which is a hallucinogenic substance that is prohibited. So now you can have your moonshiners, your red runners coming down from the mountains. We have the unionization that is occurring around the industry building, that kind of wave of industrial revolutionizing that came from that big, but also government expanding, cops. This is a post-war world, so we're out a few years from a World War I analog.
Right.
And so now the police force is militarized. What does that look like? How does that affect people?
They've inherited what has been left behind from the war, and so now there's that sort of dynamic that you have as investigators who are working outside the system. Right? So you are investigating things that maybe the governmental forces are also investigating.
Or Eons or whoever.
Eons or any of those groups. I mean, that's capitalism, right? Eons is literally 100%. Capitalism, hyper-capitalism. So we try to create forces that allow people to interact with the world in which, in a way in which we would interact with it here, right? And in our normal, we wanted to make sure it was grounded in that.
Right. So diving away a little bit from lore and into more of the mechanics, before you had a Quickstart guide for this that people could pick up if they wanted to play along while they followed the show. But now we've got this core rulebook coming out. Can you tell me the difference between first, what is a Quickstart guide? And then what is the difference between that and a core rulebook?
Well, Actually, before we had the Quickstart guide, as the audience knows it, we had a secret in-house Quickstart guide, which was really more because we were constantly changing things, so we needed a place to refer back to say what are the rules actually currently.
Yeah.
And we would give that out to playtesters, people who had to run the game, and then the questions they asked us, because they didn't feel like we're in there, either mechanically or lore, were the things that we knew we had to build in.
Yeah.
But you can probably speak more to the difference between.
Yeah, well, we have the standard edition and the limited edition. Which both are beautiful, and they both have the same content in them. And the way that they're different from the Quickstart guides. The Quickstart guide was, I think it's about 15, 20 pages of mechanics, and then like the rest was like an adventure.
Sure.
So it was pretty short.
Yeah.
It was just designed to allow people to follow along with the show.
A little taste.
Yeah. Right, just a little taste of that. And so with the full book, I mean, it has all the mechanics flushed out.
Sure.
We go into much greater detail on like guidance on how to use them. There's more, and you probably see me, if you've watched chapter 2, you'll see me use some of those new mechanics, things like countdown dice, things like setting consequences before somebody rolls.
PvP.
PvP stuff is talked about in the book, and it basically says like, hey, this is not, when you go PvP.
Just for a note, that's player versus
player, sorry.
There is an adjudication that has to happen before, like, before you, and you'll see me in the show using the rules from the book, which is like, it is now up to you as a table to decide how that happens. So like, just more guidance on things that wouldn't normally be in a Quickstart guide. And then lots of, like a whole section on the Fairelands and GMing and all those things. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What does this offer for the GM for Candela in the core rulebook that maybe wasn't in the Quickstart guide?
An entire GM section.
Oh, wow.
Everything. We got so many questions on Twitter about, what do we do with this? What do we do with that? Couldn't put it in a Quickstart guide. It's in the book. Every little detail that we could try to get ahead of the questions, we tried to get into this book. And our big thing here was also integrating the mechanics into the world so that they don't feel separate. That was a big focus for us. And I think in the Quickstart guide, just inherently people get this idea that there is mechanics as the Quickstart guide and then this adventure. And ideally in Candela Obscura, there isn't quite as much of a separation as in other games.
Yeah, I mean, we really tried to meld mechanics and lore together. And so in the GM section of the book, there are, there's lots of guidance for GMs, but also there are like hooks for how to run your sessions. There's examples of how we made sessions.
Right.
So that you can just look at it. I mean, really, they're like kind of 4-page spreads that are just like, hey, here's an adventure.
Yeah.
Right? If you structure, even if you don't use this adventure, if you structure your adventure kind of like this, it's going to be a successful game.
Yeah.
The mystery structure is a big part of it.
Yeah.
It counts as lore.
No, that's fine.
Also, we have a whole section about Old Fair.
Yeah.
Old Fair.
Yeah.
It barely exists in the
Very
Quickstart
mysterious.
guide, and it is a metaphor of the world beneath the world. Everything in Candela Obscura is what is going on beneath the surface. So there is an ancient, essentially analog for ancient Greece, ancient Rome, underneath this world. And not only are they building on top of it, but they're also building into it. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And I am so excited. Anytime people get excited about Old Fair, I become a feral animal.
And it seems like everything's coming out November 14th for the release of the actual physical book that people can pick up.
Yeah. We're really excited for it. So one last thing that I know you're excited about and that I'm excited about. You can read the book through, you can just read it for mechanics and get some of the lore and stuff, but if you pay attention to what's going on in the margins, there is a whole other story.
Oh, wow.
That is happening in the margins of the book. There's handwriting and little articles and things that on the surface you look at it and you're like, oh, that's just like a piece of art. And then you look closer and you're like, oh, there's a reason why this is here.
There is an entire secret language in this book.
Whoa.
That you can decode.
That I cannot wait for people to decode because it's a mystery book. This is a book about playing mysteries. It in and of itself should be a game of mystery.
Yeah.
The same way the art is all watercolor. It is a game where one of the effects is bleed, so all the paint is bleeding out. Hopefully the game speaks to itself and hopefully everyone translates the language.
Well, I mean, you have the opportunity to translate it yourself with the Darrington Press and doing this as like an actual play show.
Yeah.
Was that always the intention with Candela from the beginning, or did that just sort of lend itself?
An actual play show?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it actually started as a show.
Oh, okay.
And they were like, hey, let's they really love doing kind of mystery horror.
For sure.
And they were like, what if we did more of that? And what if we made a game system for that? And so really came out of the desire for a show, which is, I think, actually a really cool piece of what we do at Critical Role and at Darrington Press, which is like, games can come from anywhere. We can build a game and there could be a show based off of that, or we can have a show that they want to do and we can make a game based on that. And it really just kind of depends on what the timeline is for what we want to do, because like games take a long time to make right. If they're gonna be a book like this.
And this game coming from a show originally also means that it is designed for story-like play.
Sure.
It is designed to not have some of those mechanical bumps that make games that are great at the table, no thoughts, a bit more difficult to stream. And so this is, I would say, a story-forward game rather than a mechanics-forward game. So when folks are looking for the rules light, the easy to stream, the way to make a monster of the week, this game will be that. Versus if you're looking for a more mechanical game, I would point you like crunchy, like as you said, pulling out the protractor games, you'd go in a different direction. And because Critical Role started as a show, Darrington Press is echoing that.
Yeah, we're trying our best to make story-driven games because that's what we like to play. So it's like, we're gonna make games that we love to play. And those games, like, those crunchier kind of games exist out there. This is a 200-page book.
Right.
We are not rules lawyers at the table. We are rules public defenders.
Yeah. That's a great way to look at it.
Which is like, we're here to support the story, and we're here to support, and we're here to give you the rules. We're here to give you the rules if you want them, and allow them to support the kind of game you want to play.
But more than that, it's like, Your Honor, my player actually thinks that this rule goes against the ethics of our table because my player wants to jump off the cliff. Like,
convince me. As the GM, I'd be like, go ahead. How do you want to do this?
There were a couple moments when we first kind of rolled out at Gen Con where folks were asking me about the rules, and I'd say, oh, it's this, but throw it on, I don't care.
Yeah. Well, I love some of the mechanics that you guys have come up with, and like in the industry, sometimes we say like roses to highlight things, or stars or something.
Oh yeah, will you
that.
Explain that for folks who don't know?
I've actually gotten the chance to playtest this a couple of times before, but giving feedback, designing a game is a very personal thing, and so to word it in a phrase that's like roses for highlights or thorns for maybe pain points or questions, or stars and wishes, stars to highlight something, and I wish it had been more like this, or that's what I had in my head.
It's so useful to us as designers because we want to know what you loved, because oftentimes what you loved is just as important because it tells us where to take the things that you didn't necessarily like. So
one of the roses that I wanted to give was the bleed mechanic, because you make it so personal to the characters and you let them describe like how this thing is affecting them. What were some like difficulties coming up with some of these mechanics, or maybe some of your favorites?
Well, by the time I joined the team, the mechanics of Body, Brain, and Bleed were built into the system, but we constantly revised and went back to the idea of Body, Brain, and Bleed and how it is in discussion with the horror genre as a whole.
Sure.
Because traditionally the horror genre can be an exceptional place for people to explore what they're afraid of in real life. And people think like, oh, monsters under the bed, but also it's capitalism, it's things like poverty, it's ableism, and that can also be something that's very scary, very traumatic for folks. And so we wrote an entire section about it, how people at the table should care for their fellow players. They should really examine like body scars, brain scars, and bleed scars, and how they can tell an individualized story.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things about scars is that when you take a scar, to explain for those who haven't played, you take enough marks in either Body, Brain, or Bleed, and you clear, like if you fill up the 3, you're still good, but then if you were to take a 4th, which would push you over, then you erase all of the marks that are in that section, and then you instead take a scar. And the scar is a narrative thing that reminds you of what that is. So if something like grabbed onto your leg, you might now have a limp in your leg. And so you'd write limp as, limp in my left leg as the scar. And then your stats don't get worse, they just change.
Right.
Which means that you could take, if you wanted to go like the maybe the most obvious off the top of the head version, you could go, well, my leg, I now have a limp, so I'm gonna move, I'm gonna change my point and move, or 1 point and move down to like survey, because I'm now like looking around to make sure I'm not getting hurt, and I'm not as fast. Right? But if you wanted to, you could be like, I'm moving one from focus because I'm less able to like focus deeply on things because I'm afraid I'm gonna get hurt. I'm putting it in move. Because I wanna get out of the way so I don't get hurt again. And so by doing that, we're hoping to encourage players to think about the ways in which the experiences that they have change their characters, but don't necessarily make them worse at what they do.
Cool, because some of them are either are magical in nature too, right? I'm not going to put any spoilers, but maybe someone has flames at the tips of their fingers, or like a spine that turns into like hardened spikes on their back or something like that.
We see the way in which magic can change them, you know, an eye that can see through the veil, right? Or whatever it is, and that's a bleed scar. And so we see the more, and the way, like the places you put yourself in danger in the game are then reflected in how your character changes.
Well, and so all of this is sort of like scary and stuff like that. What makes Candela perfect for like this time of year, this scary season?
Oh, well, we always joke that Candela is horror in flavor, but thriller in actual play, just because, because so much of playing a TTRPG is doing the dun dun, dun dun, dun dun dun. It's not showing Jaws. And people, and people tend to approach Candela saying, oh, it's horror, oh, it's spooky, I have to do jump scare after jump scare after jump scare. But very often, the horror comes in the quiet parts, in thinking that something's gonna happen, even if it doesn't. But also, if we want to talk about like spooky ghosts, one of my favorite bits of history in the Fairelands is that they have a tradition of breath binding. And this comes from Old Fair. And the idea, to sum it up, in that culture was that when you die, your soul leaves your body in the form of breath and nose and mouth. And it was something that they protected very closely. And they believed that if your soul wasn't in your body anymore, something else could be in there. So the ancient Phaerons would pour molten gold over people's mouths before they buried them. Or soldiers on the battlefield would tie their hands up like this. Or if someone did something wrong, they would bury them alive with their mouths forced open. And this belief morphed over the thousands and thousands of years. And we see some people carrying it on even in New Fair. But then it evolved into this idea of pinning, where if a soul or spirit escapes, you could catch it with a pin and pin it to something. So in the main cemetery in New Fair, around all of the wooden posts, there's just hundreds of thousands of pins of people saying, this is my loved one, I want them to come back to me. Maybe if I didn't pin their spirit, they'll know where this pin is, and then they'll be able to come back. And after so many people lost sons and daughters and children and mothers and fathers to this war, it is this adaptation of beliefs that is inherently very scary. It's very scary.
The people on the battlefield were hurt and couldn't have been breath-bound. So their souls escaped. And so in the cemeteries, they're like placing these pins to call them back or to try and keep their spirits in the cemetery. And so just the idea that they were not able to be breath-bound in that war, and that's causing this new resurgence of spiritualism, which reflects exactly what happened after like World War I, right? So like that's sort of the inspiration I think for us too, is like looking at the way in which people used spiritualism in that time in the real world and thinking about how to extrapolate that out.
Right, and I think the medium and the occultist are two of the playable characters that are so obviously spooky.
But you got supernatural powers.
But you can also just build a world where everyone is a little spooky, or you can play, say, a journalist. It's a little scary.
Supernatural investigator.
The
magician is also one of the magician's abilities.
The magician is everything.
One of the magician's abilities, my favorite abilities, is called the prestige. And you have, the magician, like you have many tricks that you do that are fake. Most of your tricks are fake. There's one thing you can do that's real.
That's so interesting.
And so you make a choice of there's like a list of choices that you make, and you can do one actual piece of magic. And so that sort of brings in that, like, if you were in a world where magic did exist, then like there would be people who would like have just one little weird thing. So.
And that's how people felt about electricity at the time.
Sure.
That's another big part of it.
Yeah.
So I always imagine in my head, I say to myself, it's always raining in New Fair, which doesn't mean that it's always raining in New Fair, but it's reminding me to say, how can we do what we do in film, where when we have a sad moment, it rains?
Yeah.
You know, how can we show people, not just tell people that this is terrifying?
Right.
Yeah.
So you've done 2 seasons of the Candela Obscura show with 2 different GMs behind the screen. I wanted to ask you, and maybe one would have more of an opinion than other, but who's more menacing in this, Mercer or yourself?
Oh, see, here's the thing.
Yeah? I asked this for a reason.
Matt Mercer is the kindest person I've ever known in my entire life. And I say that sitting next to Spenser Starke, who was previously the kindest person that I had ever met in my life.
Thank you.
These kind, nice people are absolutely merciless when you give them a horror game.
Yeah.
Like, you two are both utterly savage. But I will say for me, I've played hundreds and hundreds of hours of games with Spenser. And so Spenser knows how to be scary in particular for me, the audience, and for other players that we play with all the time.
Yeah.
So I think when you know your players, it's also a totally different situation.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because Matt and I talked about how our seasons were going to be different, and Matt had the Herculean task of launching the series, and making sure everybody knew what was happening, and we like created a structure. And I had the frankly terrifying task of following Matthew Mercer.
You know, someone's got to do it.
And so coming in, it was like, okay, well, we've shown people the way that you can play traditionally, right? And the way that if you're coming from something like D&D or Pathfinder, that kind of approach, like this is the way that Matt runs games. And I was really lucky that when I came in, they were like, just run it the way you run it. Right? Don't feel like you just do your thing. And I had run lots of games for almost that exact crew to some extent, individually, but like, you know, I'd run for Marisha and Travis a lot because during the development of the game, we had to run it a bunch. And so there was, and Luis is a good friend, so like Luis has come and played. And so like, I think that they gave me the freedom to kind of be like, hey, shackles are off. Go crazy, right? And we knew that we wanted the second season, and talking with the producers and with Mercer and the whole team, we knew we wanted season 2 to just like get a little darker, get a little spookier, make it not even spookier, but like more intense, right? Like we wanted to ramp it up a little bit to show people the different ways in which the game could be run and show you that it's valid however you want to run the game. Like I run the game this way with 3 episodes and this cast and what they've given me, this is how we're running the game, which is like, I'm hitting them with marks all the time. I'm being as like, I'm being as, I'm
But they signed up for that.
And when they and actively we all said, this is what we want to do. We don't want it to feel safe.
Right.
We want it to feel like we are not as in control. Right? And I think that what was nice is what reflected that is all of their backstories kind of came together in a unique way that let me capitalize on the Last Great War being like the central focus for a lot of those characters' trauma in different capacity.
I think that also speaks to, as a player who's played under both of them, or I guess with both of them, I should say, that the horror of Candela Obscura is also very much on the shoulders of the players. This is a game where everyone should be doing the lifting together. It's not just the GM presenting horror or story to you. You can see it in Chapter 2 so beautifully. A really strong example is the way Brennan and Luis interact with each other. They serve each other up trauma and terror on a platter, and without their acceptance and enthusiasm, Spenser wouldn't be able to do all that lifting by himself. And I think you can see that in all of the players at the table.
Yeah, it's interesting because Travis came to me with a backstory that was essentially like the launch of episode 1, and then obviously the backstories of everybody else. Like I melded those into being the rest of the season, but like when Travis handed me what he had gone through, what his character had gone through, I was like, that is the story. Right, like that's the first episode. It's like, let's just dive into that. Yeah. And by giving by giving at least one of the players at the table, and at that point I had sort of melded two events together. So it was like by getting two of the players on board, everybody else starts to be like in support of that.
Right.
Right. And then we get the story where everybody is committed. And it's funny because at the end of episode 1, I mean, I was, being perfectly honest, I was so nervous, and you can see it in episode 1. I'm a little more stuttery than I am normally. I'm a little more like, I'm still getting my bearings. But at the end of episode 1, I was like, hey, how do we feel? All right, is everybody like, I know we're going hard. Is everybody cool? And they're like, go harder. And I was like, cool, you got it. We're going harder next episode. We got done with episode 2, and I was like, how do we feel? We ended on a big cliffhanger. If you haven't seen it, go watch it ends on a big cliffhanger. And I was like, how do we feel? And they're like, go harder. And we're like, okay, we're going in. So like, right. But it's like that conversation is so important at the table of like, is everybody cool with the way in which this is being run?
Yeah.
Because if you're not, we can always adjust it. But everybody was like, no, we're so in, and we want to run it. We want to drive it like a stolen car.
You guys also showed off one of the mechanics that exists in the book and didn't exist in the Quickstart guide, which is relationships.
Right.
And you see it only at the table. You don't necessarily see the behind the scenes, but there's a portion in the book that asks you to pick your relationship with all the other people in the circle. Everyone has one to one another.
And they did that for the show, right?
Yeah.
Because you can see it.
Yes, always. And it could be something like best friend, lover, it could be stranger, it could be muse. And it's even more interesting maybe if I say, you're my best friend, but you say, I'm a stranger.
Yeah.
What's going on there? Having those relationships is a lot of ways building the wall so you can tear it down, or building the foundation so you can build the haunted house.
Perfect.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what you guys really showed off that's not in the Quickstart.
Yeah, we really pushed into those relationships in the second season, allowing the characters allowing the reveals of their backstories and their relationships to come out organically, not only through like the action scenes that we're in, which we saw in episode 2, where Luis and Travis and Brennan all went into this room and cleared it. In one roll, they cleared the whole room. And that was this perfect example for me of them playing into the relationships that they formed, which was like, we are all in a platoon together.
Right.
Like we've all done this thing before. The other stuff is all new, but this we know.
Yeah.
And so allowing the sort of like story to take the reins in those moments and not require 18 different roles to see if you kill all these. It's like, no, we're doing this the way that you all would do it, which is like one moment between all of you, and whatever the ramifications are, you suffer it together. And they rolled a critical success.
Right,
so like
it was amazing to watch. So for people at home that want to play Candela Obscura, there are a few terms that they might want to be familiar with. One would be the flare, which is this barrier between like our world and this supernatural world. And places that are particularly strange may have a thinning, or this, a thinner version of this barrier.
Yeah, the flare has thinned enough that things can pass through.
Right. So I wanted to throw out some locations, because this might be something that a GM could do with their home game, and see where there would be maybe a thinning. The first one that comes to mind is something like Stonehenge, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, we do have a nod to Stonehenge and truly places like that around the world in the book.
Yeah.
Our artist Amelia really honed that in with me, but there is a place on the verge. There are monoliths to give people Stonehenge if they want it.
Yeah.
Can you talk about like what is the effects there, the supernatural things that occur?
Here's the thing, we didn't get super rulesy and specific about it, because part of having your Stonehenge is saying, well, this circle is terrified of loss.
Sure.
Now this is a gravesite, an ancient gravesite, or this circle is hedonistic and it has come to ill ends. Now this was a place of revelry. What kind of magic was on there? So we gave people again the sandbox from the real world.
Well, and I think that one of the things we really tried to embrace is like, I think about games a lot as something called the Kuleshov Effect, and I talk about this all the time. I love the Kuleshov Effect because it is a thing that allows us to be collaborative while still having structure.
Right.
So the Kuleshov Effect, for those who don't know, it comes from this like experiment in film where people would take an image, Kuleshov, specifically Kuleshov, not people, but Kuleshov. This specific person took an image of a man's face, and then I'm gonna get the actual things wrong, but as an idea, an image of a man's face, and then showed, and then a shot of a hamburger, and put them side by side, and asked the audience what that man was like.
He looks hungry.
Right. He looks hungry. Same image of the man's face, and a grave.
Right.
He looks sad.
Right. He looks sad or he looks hungry because we know what that image is next to. And so when you take so basically the Kuleshov effect is two images that are juxtaposed to create a third image that wouldn't exist without those two images being combined. And so a lot of my games do this. Icarus does this, where you get a motive and a pillar. Alice is Missing does this, where you get a clue card and you get either a suspect or location, and you combine them. But in the way in which we approach this, it's like, okay, we're giving you our encouragement from the GM side and from like even the player side is like, take the thing, well, as a GM specifically, take the thing that your players are, the thing that player is excited about or is in their backstory, and then combine it with this other weird, esoteric, strange thing that we've given you that has mystery surrounding it. Put them together and then create this third image that wouldn't exist if we were to be like, this is a gravesite. Right? It's like, no, this is a place of magic or a place of like mystery, and there's specific details that are interesting. There's one that's like, there's a, I'm drawing a blank on it, but it's a place in the Stentorian River where the tide recedes and on the rocks.
That is based on a real thing in the real world.
Yeah.
Okay, so if the tide goes down low enough on the rocks, and I'm gonna forget the ancient Faireland that it says, but it basically says, if you can read this, they're coming for you.
Because the tide is so low.
Yeah, because the tide is so low. What does that mean?
That is some.
So that's actually based on a thing in the real world that we found that you knew about.
People have written on rocks, essentially, kind of, if you can read this, like, it's bad. And if I'm remembering correctly, and I hope that I'm not messing this up, it was more related to famine and starvation. Like, if the water's low, it's bad for you. But it's really cool if it's a monster.
And so you can take that kind of thing and combine it with somebody who's like, hey, I want to play this person who is a dock worker on the river, and I've seen this weird creature that keeps coming out when, out of the river. And you're like, okay, cool, that's my backstory of how I got into Candela. And I'm like, okay, I found that thing in the book. I'm going to take them there and they're going to go, I know what they're talking about with this. Right now, suddenly you've pulled them in. So the whole idea is creating these mystery boxes that let people fill them with the kinds of stories their players are interested in.
So I know that you focus on a specific time period for the shows, but could a player at home do something in a different time period? If, for instance, they came towards an Arby's and felt that there may be a thinning in that liminal space?
Arby's are very liminal. It's giving Waffle House.
Fighting in the Waffle House.
Going to a diner at 2 a.m. Between 2 and 4, maybe. It hits different.
It's all the theater kids and...
Yes, actually, yes. No, but totally, like we talked like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just gonna say, like we talked about, like malls and back rooms, right? Like these kinds of places that are sort of tongue-in-cheek, but like, yes, you can find inspiration from anything in our world. And we actually encourage in the book you to pull from the things that excite you from the real world. And also by placing it in a fictional world, allow you to create separation so that you don't have you don't have to make it something that is based on the real world. You can combine two cool ideas to make it or three ideas.
Very useful when so much of the past has been problematic.
We built the Fairelands specifically to give people a safe space to enjoy Gaslamp Turn of the Century, because like as a queer woman, I don't want to play in a world that's homophobic. That's not fun.
Exactly.
Turn of the Century is awful. And we have played different games, and one set in the real world where I played a queer woman and she couldn't go to college. She couldn't have a wife. What are you talking about? That's not fun for me. And so we wanted to build the Fairelands, so that's not baked in. This place has a lot of issues. There's a lot of social stratification based on wealth especially, but it is not inherently homophobic. It is not inherently racist. This is a place where people immigrate a lot. And in making this safe sandbox, I hope that we're inviting people also to tackle the demons that are useful for them to tackle. So we've also run games where players said to me, like, we actually want to destroy homophobia. Yes. And so I built a politician that was wildly homophobic, was trying to, partnered with a monster through magic, blah, 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 trying to make legislation about it. And then they killed him. And then homophobia was gone. It's being able to defeat the monsters that haunt you in the real world is so cathartic. But you can't do that if you don't start with a place that is safe.
Yeah.
Both at the table and in this fictional world.
And being able to place upon and back off from the kinds of themes that you're interested in, and like exactly like you said, if there is a thing that you at the table are really interested in tackling, you can put it in the book, but we aren't inherently asking you to either ignore the real history of the world or trounce upon it in a way that feels disrespectful.
Another really good example of that is our home games. We really like to tackle things around mental health. So there is Graceland Sanatorium, which is based on those awful turn of the century places that people were sent. Featured. But it is fun to enter and defeat a horrific asylum in a fictional place. But if you put that in the real world and made it an asylum where people had actually suffered and died, it feels really different and it feels bad in a way that once you fictionalize it, again, you can defeat it.
Well, I mean, we've had 2 seasons so far of Candela Obscura. The second season's ending soon. Can you give our audience any teasers about what they could expect for this ending?
So, we left it on a cliffhanger. There is, I don't want to give any spoilers, but what I will say, is that somebody asked me before, if I give one word, so no spoilers, but one word.
Okay.
This final episode, I would say, is about sacrifice.
Oh no!
It is about thinking about the protection of others instead of yourself, and we're gonna see that theme. Really, I mean, it's been there, but this episode in particular is all about looking out for the people around us and ensuring that the people that we love are protected. So it's a doozy.
I tweeted that the second episode was the most harrowing TTRPG playing I've ever seen. But the third episode's about to come out, and that then became the most harrowing. I was behind the curtain during all of that, and there is a moment when everyone behind the curtain collectively gasped. We all had to put our hands over our mouths because they're recording it. And I just remembered looking over at Max, our producer, with my eyes wide, and he just went.
It's a wild episode.
Oh man. Well, hopefully people will be able to spot that moment as it happens.
They won't miss it.
And they'll have their gasps at home. Thank you so much for joining and for bringing this wonderful game to life. I think that it's going to light up a lot of gaming tables, and it already has in the actual play that you've done.
Thank you.
And make sure to grab your copy of the Candela Obscura core rulebook everywhere November 14th, and follow us at Tabletop News everywhere at Watch Tabletop. Thanks to Noble Knight Games for sponsoring this clip. Use promo code TTN10OFF for 10% off your next purchase at nobleknight.com.